So I thought it would be interesting to compare my tips on both Uber and Lyft and see if one was better than the other, and also take a deep dive into my tips to see if I can find some other insights. Let's discuss. Really quickly, if you have yet to download the Solo app to help you manage your rideshare business and earn more, our referral link will be in the description. So first off, I drive in Minneapolis and St. Paul on Mondays and Tuesdays. I drive all day. It's mostly daytime driving. So this tipping analysis could be different for other drivers in other markets depending on when you drive. Do you drive other days? Do you drive during the evening? Do you drive on the weekend? Now, as far as tips, I don't actively search out tips. I don't ask for tips. I try to create an environment for tipping. I want a clean car, clean inside and clean outside. I'll wash my car every single week. I'll clean the inside of my car. Typically, I don't need to vacuum the inside of my car. If I do, I will. All I typically do though is I'll check my back seat for debris. If there's debris, I'll wipe that off, and then I shake out my mats at least once a week. Also, I try to read my passengers, see if they want to engage or not. If they don't want to engage, say they have their headphones in or they seem quiet, I'll leave them alone. I won't try and talk to them, but if I do see that they want to engage, I'll try to engage them in conversation. Also, the main rides that I get tips on, airport rides, I always try to help with bags, both for drop-offs and pickups. All right, now as far as the analysis of my tips, for my sample size, I used my last 100 rides with both Uber and Lyft. With Uber, 29 of those 100 riders left a tip, so that's nearly 1 out of every 3 riders. I earned $1,320 over those 100 rides, and 147 of that was in tips, roughly 11% of my total earnings. Now, my largest tip was technically $30, but I returned an item for that rider, and that is why they tipped me that amount, so I have no idea if they would have tipped at all. So I actually calculated this down to a $5 tip for this analysis. But my next largest tip was $15.86 on an airport ride. The distance was 28 miles and the duration was 32 minutes. Total earnings for that trip, including tip, were $47.35. All right, I had 42 rides that were 10 miles or longer and received a tip on 16 of them, basically 2 out of every 5 passengers. And the other 58 rides were less than 10 miles and I received a tip on 13 of those rides, basically 1 out of every 5 passengers. I gave 16 airport rides and received tips on 11 of those, basically 2 out of every 3 passengers. And I gave 27 minimum fare rides and received a tip on only 6 of them, 1 out of every 5 passengers. So almost 1 out of every 3 passengers tipped. Most of my tips came on longer rides, and a lot of those longer rides included airport rides, and also my tips accounted for 11% of my total earnings. Now let's take a look at Lyft. On Lyft, 24 of the 100 riders tipped, basically 1 out of every 4 riders. I earned $1,282 over those 100 rides, and 111 of that was in tips, accounting for about 9% of my total earnings. My largest tip was $11.10 on another airport ride. The distance on that ride was 25 miles with a duration of 43 minutes, and total earnings including tip were $39.20. All right, I gave 48 rides that were 10 miles or longer and received a tip on 12 of them, basically 1 out of every 4 passengers. And I gave 52 rides that were less than 10 miles and 12 of them tipped on those as well, 1 out of every 4 passengers again. I gave 10 airport rides on Lyft and 7 passengers tipped. Just like Uber, basically 2 out of every 3 passengers tipped. And I also gave 27 minimum fare rides and only 6 tips on those, 1 out of every 5 passengers. So on Lyft, 1 out of every 4 passengers tipped. I did find it interesting that on my rides that were longer than 10 miles, which was roughly half of my rides, I received 12 tips, and the other half, which were less than 10 miles, I received 12 tips. And again, a good amount of tips came from airport rides, and just like Uber, 2 out of 3 passengers tipped on airport rides. So overall, on Uber, I received 5 more tips. I also gave 6 more airport rides on Uber. So that's the main difference, it's those airport rides. My chances of receiving a tip on airport rides are much higher than all other rides, including those other longer rides. And I do feel like those airport riders are infrequent users. They're not weekly users of the platforms. I feel like those frequent users, those weekly users of the platforms, they don't tip. They don't tip very often at all, which I do understand to a certain extent. Taking a bunch of rides, it probably adds up for them. But for me personally, I've always thought it would be ideal to drive for a platform of all infrequent users. And that's what I'm actually hoping for from Rides, the company that launched here in Minneapolis and St. Paul a couple months ago. Less drivers, but a better overall driver pool. and less more infrequent riders, but better fares overall, better tips and perks on rides. But what about all of you? Have you done an analysis like this, or do you just have a pretty good idea on how tipping is for you? Also, what markets do you drive in? What days do you drive? Do you drive evenings? Do you drive weekends? Also, what kind of environment do you create for tipping? Do you have tip signs? Do you encourage riders to tip? Again, on both platforms, I personally am receiving a tip from 1 out of every 4 passengers, and 2 out of every 3 airport passengers are tipping me. If you've yet to download the Solo app to help you manage your rideshare business and earn more, our referral link is in the description. We also have a free newsletter, and the link to sign up for that is in the description as well. If you've yet to watch my previous video on the Lyft cancellation notice, be sure to check that one out. Thanks again for watching, and drive safe. Thanks.